must be our goal and our guide. And all that we strive for as a human family, dignity and hope, progress and prosperity, depends on peace. But peace depends on us.
Seven tips for protecting yourself against the coronavirus. 1. Wash your hands regularly with soap and water or with an alcohol-based gel. 2. Need to cough or sneeze? Do it into a tissue or a bent elbow and then wash your hands. 3. Stay at least a meter away from other people, especially if they are coughing, sneezing, or have a fever. 4. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth. 5. Avoid direct contact with live animals. If this is impossible, make sure to clean your hands afterwards. 6. Do not eat raw or poorly cooked animal products and wash your hands, clean surfaces, and utensils afterwards. 7. If you develop a fever, cough, or difficulty in breathing, seek medical care.
Good afternoon. About 29 minutes past noon here in Nairobi. This is Diaspora Dispatches, where we shall quickly get into looking at the news making headlines across Africa this afternoon. I know it is morning in other parts of Africa and the morning in our viewers from Europe and indeed other parts of the world. So thank you so much for finding time and for being with us today. I know we still have to talk about this coronavirus because every day we wake up and we see the numbers in Africa especially starting to peak, and so even the countries, a few countries that still have not recorded any cases, but you've seen there has been an increase of some cases in Africa, not too much to the point of alarm, but I think very quick and measures should be taken to make sure that the countries in Africa do not suffer, because according to World Health Organization, and we shall get into that in quite a bit, they're saying should this virus really record very high, infections here in Africa, then we are doomed owing to our facilities, owing to our medical facilities and the staff that we have and our capacity. In other countries, we don't even still have the testing kits, so it's a very dire situation. So thank God there is a number, but it's not as dire as other parts of the world, say like Europe, in Italy, or there, so it's very interesting. And yesterday we were reading, I think on the newspaper, they've opened all the 44, is it 40 or 44 stores of Apple stores across China, and it is business as usual. Schools are back into session, and the rest of us are still grappling with this. And in Africa, it appears a lot of cases that are coming into the country are coming from outside of this continent. It's very challenging, because how do you tell somebody not to return home, but on the other hand, if it's not very urgent, can they just stay over there and make sure they're safe and the rest of us are safe on this side? And when it is appropriate, then we can just socialize and network and visit and just have a good time. But in the meantime, I think very important, social distancing measures must be taken by all means necessary. So thank you so much, Diaspora Dispatches. We get to look at the latest news across Africa, and we cannot escape. We still have to look at some of the states that have been affected. I'm looking at my news this morning, and it's just about the coronavirus and what the different African countries are doing. But still, we have some other news in there that might not be related, but also we shall talk about. So let's have these very important conversations, and we start with that press conference by World Health Organization. And now it said that African countries have been told to prepare for the worst by the head of the World Health Organization. In all, 16 deaths have been reported, 6 in Egypt, 6 in Algeria, 2 in Morocco, 1 in Sudan, and 1 in Burkina Faso. Africa has been the least affected continent, but health experts warn that strained public public health systems could become quickly overwhelmed. The head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, is quoted by news agencies saying that Africa should wake up. In other countries, we have seen how the virus actually accelerates after a certain tipping point. That was the message from World Health Organization. And, you know, he's an Ethiopian, so he understands better the infrastructures in a lot of African countries. So he said it's time Africa woke up. All right. And still in that, we move to Algeria, and Algeria's President Abdelmadjid Tebboune has ordered all land borders to be closed and all flights except those carrying freight to be suspended as part of measures to prevent the spread of coronavirus. He also banned mass gatherings, including demonstrations and congregational prayers. However, mosques will continue to perform the call for prayers. And we go to Uganda, where all Ugandans have been banned from traveling to the countries most affected by the coronavirus. In an address to the nation, President Yoweri Museveni also said that Ugandans returning to the country will be quarantined at a medical facility for 2 weeks, where they will have to meet their own daily expenses for things such as food and water. Hey, come on now. All right, Museveni there. And all education institutions are to be closed from Friday. That is in Uganda. And we move to Mali, and a campaign group, Human Rights Watch, has criticized the Malian military and the UN for failing to prevent a massacre in a remote Fulani village, which left at least 35 people dead. Last month's attack by a Dogon ethnic militia in Ogosagu happened straight after the Malian army had withdrawn from the area. Soldiers had been positioned there to offer protection following another attack in the same village a year ago, in which 150 people were killed. The rights group learned that frantic calls were made to the Malian authorities as well as to the UN peacekeepers mission, warning of an imminent attack. We move to Zambia, and Zambia has confirmed its first 2 cases of the COVID-19, the respiratory illness caused by the coronavirus, including a couple who had traveled to France. The health minister has confirmed they had gone on a holiday for 10 days with their children and were told to self-isolate to their return home on Sunday. And now Mali has confirmed its first 2 cases. And we go to Burkina Faso, and Burkina Faso has announced its first death from the COVID-19, and it is the first recorded death from the coronavirus in West Africa. The authorities say the patient was Rose Marie Campaore, a vice president in the National Assembly. She was a diabetic woman aged 62 years old. And we go to South Africa, and more than 1,700 people are stranded on a cruise liner and a cargo ship off the coast of Cape Town in South Africa over fears that some of them are infected with coronavirus. Concerns were raised by the port authorities after a member of the cargo ship's crew, who had flown in from Turkey on the 9th of March, began to show symptoms of the virus. He has been isolated on board the MV Corona along with another crew member he was with on the flight from Turkey. What is that, the name of the cruise liner, MV Corona, or this is just the name it has been given now? Confusing there. And we move to Nigeria. And the country has placed a travel ban on people coming from 13 countries worst affected by the coronavirus outbreak, as 5 new cases were recorded in Africa's most populous nation. That brings the country's total number of patients COVID-19 to 8. Health Minister Osagie Ehanire said contact tracing for the new cases was ongoing. All the 5 had traveled to the UK or to the US. And we go to Niger, and Niger's President Muhammadu Issoufou has announced the closure of the country's land borders, Niamey Airport, and its educational institutions to prevent the entry into the territory of coronavirus. There are currently no confirmed cases of the virus in the landlocked African country, and the measures follow a trend where African countries are issuing directives to combat the virus. And we go to South Sudan, and the first vice president says corruption is a stigma. That will be Mr. Riek Machar. He's saying corruption is a stigma that the unity government should fight in order to redeem its tarnished image. Last year, Transparency International ranked South Sudan the third It's not even the third, the second most corrupt country in the world. It attributed the reasons to weak democratic foundation and the manipulation of the undemocratic and populist politicians who use it to their advantage. The Minister of Information quotes Dr. Riek Machar saying that fighting corruption could help in the unity government to regain trust from the citizens and the international community. And still staying with South Sudan and the U.S. government to remain actively engaged with relevant institutions to ensure that human rights are respected in South Sudan. The U.S. State Department Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor has said in an annual comprehensive fact-based report on the state of respect for human rights around the world, the U.S. has documented human rights violations in South Sudan. These include arbitrary deprivation of life and other unlawful or politically motivated killings, disappearance of individuals, torture, and other cruel and inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment of people. And we move to Ambazonia, where the 10 detained Ambazonia separatist leaders are expected to return to court today as they appeal against a life sentence. That the appeal will start today. Now the Court of Appeal of the Center region will begin hearing the cases as the Ambazonia leaders want the life sentence passed on them by the Yoda military tribunal overturned. Detained Ambazonia leader Julius Ayub Tabe last week reiterated their resolve to negotiate with Yaoundé on neutral grounds, but insisted their drive for a breakaway state is still very much alive. And we move to Mauritius, and still on coronavirus, and Mauritius confirms first 3 corona cases. Mauritius has also confirmed the first 3 corona cases, and 2 of the 3 cases include cruise ship workers aged 21 and 25, while the third is a traveller from the UK aged 59. And Prime Minister Pravid Jugnauth said the 3 have been placed in isolation. Very interesting there from Africa this morning, and we see all these cases that are coming out of the country, and there has been debates on whether it is important for anybody that is outside the continent to come in. All these cases in Africa have been imported from outside, Africa, and there has been, as I said, there are debates on whether this will be the right time for people to come back home and visit, unless it's really, really necessary. Then it is advisable for our loved ones to just stay over there and make sure they're safe over there, because we see even they could have left their place of residence as okay, but perhaps through a contact, the airport or otherwise, by the time they get to the different countries in Africa, they come in sick. And so all these people, all these new cases, you hear a person had traveled from the UK, a person had traveled from the US, a person had traveled somewhere from Europe and across the continent, across that side of the world. And so now here in Africa we have to wonder, and when you consider this warning from the World Health Organization that is saying that African countries should wake up. So should we wake up in this regard, that perhaps stop some of these flights from these countries? I know it could be difficult, especially if you have loved ones from those countries that have been affected, and you're worried about their safety. But sometimes I think they're safer over there. If anything, they have better facilities there and better ways of responding to this illness, because the World Health Organization is telling us when they look at the infrastructure here in Africa, and African countries have not really prepared for this, for the worst, because it took a while before the coronavirus hit the continent, but now we see slowly but surely the numbers keep increasing every day, and now the continent has registered 16 deaths only. Well, compared to the other countries, I think it's a bit low, but still, 1 death is just one too many, and if we can avoid to have any more, then that will be better for us. And the countries that have registered these deaths include Egypt, which has registered about 6 deaths, and 6 in Algeria, and 2 in Morocco, and 1 in Sudan, and 1 in Burkina Faso. And even as this happens, 6 deaths have been registered in Algeria. Remember, the opposition have been calling on Algerians who have been organizing for this every weekly Friday demonstrations to stop. Remember, the protest from Algeria has not really stopped. They started last year, protesting the removal of their former president, Mr. Abdulaziz Bouteflika, who was disposed and removed from power after 20 years. Remember, if I could just jog back your memory in what happened there in Algeria, they started the calls. No, I think it had started from Sudan early in December of 2018, and then Algeria started in early February, calling on the president to resign, President Abdulaziz Bouteflika. I remember as they were calling for the president to resign, the elections had been slated to take place, I think, in May of last year. Is it in May of the thereabout? I can't remember the exact month. And the president had announced his intention of running for presidency. So what Algerians did not understand is why Mr. Bouteflika then wanted to run for presidency. He had led the country for 20 years, and in his 20 years, a lot of things happened that were not okay. There were rampant corruption cases, and on top of that, he had suffered a stroke in 2013, if I'm not wrong, that had really disposed him, and he was not able to carry out his presidential duties as well as he should. And so Algerians said no. And I remember just earlier in February, he left and went for treatment. I think, was it in Switzerland? I stayed there for 2 weeks and came back. So he left while the protest had just started. They not gained momentum as such, but they had just started, and I think he thought, you know what, they're just few university students, this is just few, citizens, and they'll get tired and they'll go home. But slowly but surely, the protest gained momentum, and before you know it, 2 weeks later, he came back, and he was met with a huge protest and demonstrations against his leadership, and Algerians calling for him not to run and calling for him to step down. And what has been very interesting about these Algerian demonstrations, and as you look, they demonstrate every week. They have been very, very dedicated to these demonstrations. They demonstrated, and after a couple of months in April, we saw earlier April there, Mr. Abdulaziz Bouteflika resigning. Actually, he was forced to resign because, as it appeared, the army was siding with the people. And when the army that you are the commander-in-chief of is not siding with you, then as a president of any country, then you are in trouble. And so the army took a very neutral stand, and was not siding with the president. Matter of fact, it is the army that came out. The head of the army at that time, commander, came out and gave an ultimatum and said, if you cannot resign, you have until this is what the people are asking for. So if you cannot resign, then we shall have a coup over here. And so Mr. Bouteflika was coerced to resign, and he resigned. And as I said, he's been on a wheelchair since 2013. The guy could not even perform his duties right. He had suffered from a stroke, not a fault of his own, but you cannot perform. Should you die in power? This mentality by African leaders, even when you cannot perform, you still insist, I have to sit there. Look at Mr. Paul Biya. How old is that guy? He celebrated 87 years last year. An 87-year-old, and according to the Constitution, he still have more years to go, and he wants to stay there until he dies there. It's very interesting the way we look at and we perceive leadership here in Africa, and the leaders that we have and the leaders that we elect. I don't even want to start talking about Uganda and the way we've seen. Remember that commander there in Uganda, after he came out and announced that he wants to challenge President Museveni for the 2021 elections elections next year. Before you know it, yesterday I was reading from one of the newspapers there in Uganda that now he's been taken to jail. They're charging him with treason. They raided his home. They found, I don't know, guns. It's just ridiculous. And I was just wondering, I think it will come to a point where Ugandans will get tired of this nonsense, because in a country, we are in the 21st century, we should allow for people to express their democratic right as long as they're not stepping on your feet. And we've seen such very aggressive measures being meted against Mr. Bobi Wine, against the official opposition leader Mr. Kizza Besigye there in Uganda. And so Very interesting. And of course, Uganda's democracy is always under trial there. So we saw in Algeria they protested, and when the army was not siding with the President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, he did not have a choice. He was coerced, and so he moved out. He was removed, and I think now he's still seeking for treatment and things like that. And then shortly after, the protesters continued demanding that everybody that was allied, all the top officials, everybody that was allied to Mr. Bouteflika's presidency be held accountable. And you've seen a lot of them going through the judicial process in Algeria, including his own brother, who is now serving 15 years jail term after being found corrupt by the Algerian court, among other officials and other ministers and other people of high-ranking positions who served under President Bouteflika's presidency there in Algeria in his long 20 years presidency there. And so we see about 2 weeks ago, the opposition organizers came up and, were calling on the protesters to stop with this protest because it is not safe for them. So I hope they took heed to these calls because now we see Algeria is among the first African countries that have registered a number of people who have died from this virus, the COVID-19. That is, Egypt has 6 deaths, and also Algeria has 6 deaths, and 2 in Morocco, and of course Sudan registered 1 death on Sunday and 1 in Burkina Faso. I think Burkina Faso is the latest country to register some deaths there. So it's just a bit of some just to take us back on the events there on Algeria and why these calls by opposition for the protesters to stop this weekly protest could help save lives there and curtail the spread of COVID-19. So if you're wondering why they're calling for this protest to stop, that is the reason why they have been protesting since earlier last year until today, because even after the new president was elected, remember, they refused to go to an election, but the elections happened anyway because the country had to move on. There are things that needed to be signed by an elected president. There are things that could not be done by the person who was acting at the capacity as the head of state, and so election had to be done, and the Algerians did not really want the elections to take place because they were calling for some officials who are going to officiate over these elections to step aside, and a lot of other people who they wanted to step aside before they could go to an election. But the elections happened anyway. They did not like it, so they've been protesting over that every Friday. So they've been told, come on now, perhaps it is time you suspended this a weekly protest as part of measures to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. So I'm just hoping that Algerians, you heed to that call for your own safety and for your own good and for the country's good, and especially seeing that the country already is among the first countries that have registered death there in Africa. And so, yes, just trying to get another country that is another story just outside of the corona. Have we not talked so much about coronavirus until at this point, people have become very paranoid because the news that is happening. But before I stop talking about corona, I think I have to, in relation to Nigeria, don't ask me why, I always have to talk about Nigeria, because I'm thinking that Nigeria, being that it's the biggest economy in Africa, it's an important country as far as Africa is concerned, and the things that happen in that country, the insecurity that is happening in that country. And we saw the other day the president, the country say that they are allowing, flights for the countries that have been affected by the coronavirus to come into Nigeria. And yesterday and the other day, we were just sitting here wondering, why would President Buhari and his administration put at risk 200 plus million people lives at risk by allowing flights from these countries that have registered very high number of infections? Iran, South Korea, China, which miraculously has even nearly is shutting down the hospital it has built for the coronavirus patients because they're not registering any new infections. They need to tell us what they did there, but I hear they might have used some other unorthodox means to get rid of the patients. I don't know, allegedly, so it has not been confirmed, but they should tell us how they went about reducing the numbers of new infections. And so Nigeria, at that point, there were no cases that were registered, but the government was very bold and said everybody is welcome to come to Nigeria. It is business as usual, and before you know it, 3 cases were registered, and up to yesterday, and now as we speak, the cases have gone up to 8. So now is when the government is coming out to place a travel ban on people coming from 13 countries worst affected by the corona outbreak. I do not understand. I think it's just 2 days ago here where we were looking at the subject of why Africans reactive and not proactive. Nigeria had an opportunity to not allow, to protect the country and to not allow any infections and the country to stay like that from these highly infected countries. But it opened its doors, and now we see the numbers are catching up. And very interesting, I was reading a news early in the morning. I think I must have forgotten to compile it with the rest of the items that I had this morning about the Senate calling on President Buhari to come out and give a speech. President Buhari, since this the coronavirus struck, even Nigeria, the first time that the country registered the deaths, we've seen every president in this continent coming out, even the worst of them all in the world, coming out and trying to just calm the citizens and just trying to tell them what is happening and give them the report and the government position and the preparedness that the government is having, and just to ensure that the people are safe and just to calm people down. So it is taking now the Senate of Nigeria to call on President Buhari to come out and give a speech. He has not done that, and tell people what is happening and update Nigerians on what the government is doing. Should he take the Senate or legislators or the citizens of Nigeria for the president to understand his position as the head of state, to come out and assure his people about what is happening and what the measures the government is putting in place to ensure that they are safe. So the government of Nigeria has failed. President Buhari has not come out. Now the Senate is calling on him to come out and to give statements and to ensure that Nigerians are safe, which I found to be very interesting. If you require Senate to come out and tell you how to do your work, Mr. President, I do not understand. If you really, the head of state comes with a lot of responsibilities. And I was just reading another item earlier today from an online news forum, and it read that President Buhari's problem is his attitude. Remember the explosion that happened on Sunday, that now I think 20 Nigerians lost their lives? The president has not even made an attempt to go even to the site and see. Instead, there are people, the public officials who went there, took photos, and they were being photographed in State House there in Nigeria while they were showing the president the photographs of the explosion scene as a head of state. Can you just take your time, go there and try to assure Nigerians that you are with them, and try to, to mourn with them, and just try to as a symbol of national unity, a head of state, you're supposed to be that. So President Buhari waited. He could not even show up, even after the fire had been put off. Any president, even the worst in the world, would have shown up and just tried to show that, don't worry, the government is in control, and console even with the families that lost their loved ones. Buhari instead, the government officials went there and took photos, and now they were being photographed in his official residence there, being showed the photos of the site of the explosion. So according to this article, President Buhari's big problem is his attitude, and I wouldn't agree more. I think President Buhari is so aloof and out of touch with what is happening in Nigeria, and so he requires the Senate to tell him, Mr. President, you need to come out and address the nation and come, the tension and the anxiety and the panic that the people of Nigeria are going through at this point. So very interesting there. And we see some news from South Sudan, and the first vice president says corruption is a stigma. The first vice president, that is Mr. Riek Machar, is saying corruption is a stigma that the unity government should fight in order to redeem its tarnished image. Yes, that is very true, because according to Transparency International Corruption Index, South Sudan comes at number 2. Somalia is the most corrupt country in the world, followed by South Sudan. And so it will take a lot for South Sudan to remove this stigma from itself. And now Riek Machar is speaking against it and is saying that it is he's saying that corruption is a stigma and that the unity government should fight in order to redeem its tarnished image. Last year, of course, as I said, Transparency International ranked South Sudan the second most corrupt country in the world, and it attributed the reasons to weak democratic foundation and the manipulation of undemocratic and populist politicians who use it to their advantage. Can we just look at that second part of that sentence? Of course, there are a very weak democratic foundation. We know how South Sudan has been, the war that they've had in that country for now about 7 years, until the signing of the peace deal on the 22nd of February. And we're waiting to see, we're waiting for the people of South Sudan to go back to their countries and not to continue to be fed in the refugee camps, as we've seen the United Nations Refugee Council asking for more money to feed South Sudanese refugees in these refugee camps. And I'm thinking, no, it is time they went back. But the reason why that might take a while is the level of corruption and the level of manipulation and the level of populist leadership that is going on there in South Sudan. And of course, we have seen that the interest of the people of South Sudan is not at the core of the leadership of South Sudan. And so I'm not surprised by these attributions as to the reasons as to why corruption is very rampant there in South Sudan. Of course, owing to the many years of war, the 6 to 7 years of war that has been going on there in South Sudan until the signing of the peace deal. I think structures and institutions there have been affected, and so there have not been proper structures of checks and balances. And corruption has really thrived in that country. But also, I think the willingness by the leadership to fight corruption there has been very lacking. You see, South Sudan, as much as it has been in turmoil, it has still been making some income from the oil that the country is having. 24 hours, we see the oil passing through these pipes. Nobody can account for it. And of course, that Downing report that came out last year that says a lot of multinational, international companies from the UK, China, US are really benefiting in that chaos that is happening in South Sudan. And what really caught my eye in that report is they said the leadership, including the president of South Sudan, Mr. Salva Kiir, and other political leaders in that country are actually benefiting from the chaos in that country. So you understand why the dilly-dallying of the signing of the peace agreement and why they were really very hesitant to just end and just sign for the country to continue is because these people are actually benefiting and they sacrificed the people of South Sudan at the altar of ego and greed. And today we see, of course, the people of South Sudan do not have confidence in the leadership. They have shown, if at all they had confidence in the leadership of their leaders, then already they would have wanted to go home. The refugees, the over 2 million refugees that are in camps in countries like Uganda, Kenya, and other countries in the region, and indeed across the world. And so they don't have, because the security is not guaranteed, and nobody's talking about them and their welfare. So we're waiting to see how this new government is going to address this matter. But the Minister of Information quotes Dr. Riek Machar saying that fighting corruption could help the unity government to regain trust from the citizens and the international community. That is very well stated, but can you now, Mr. Riek Machar, can you walk the talk? We know talking is very well, and you people can really articulate yourselves very well, but we've seen you speak with one side of the mouth and speak something else with totally different from the other side of the mouth. And if this is really the cancer that is not killing just South Sudan but also other countries in Africa, and we've seen some leaders in this continent just making an effort in fighting this, so I think South Sudan is also no exception. And if you really have identified this as one of the reasons as to why South Sudan, development might be curtailed, then Mr. Riek Machar and the leadership of South Sudan, you have a job to do. Now what we want and what South Sudanese want is for you to actually walk the talk. As we speak today, we move to Ambazonia, where the 10 detained Ambazonian separatist leaders are expected to return to court today to appeal against the life sentence that was handed over to them sometimes back last year. I don't know if that will be possible because the last I checked, Cameroon, as of March 17th, the government said it has shut down land, air, sea borders indefinitely, starting from, I think, yesterday, international flights were grounded with no exception of cargoes. So I don't know if the court sessions are going, because I know in Kenya here, I think all have been closed down, but Cameroon has, I think, registered, coronavirus cases there. And so now I don't know if this case that was facing the Ambazonia leaders will proceed as it had been planned at the Court of the Appeal today in Yaoundé. Remember, they were handed over a life sentence after being passed on from a military tribunal there in Yaoundé. I do not understand how you're going to try a civilian in a martial court, in a military court. It has never happened anywhere in the world. So being led by Julius Ayuk Tabe, they're now serving a life sentence there, and they're being charged with, among others, treason, and they want, of course, secession for Ambazonia. And it's the same thing that is happening in Nigeria with Biafrans, except the leader of the Biafran movement was able to escape from Nigeria, Mr. Nnamdi Kanu, and is now out of the country and safe over there. This is after the Nigerian government was really after his neck sometimes back a couple of years ago. Well, still is, but he was able to escape. So Mr. Ayuk Tabe, and among 9 others, are supposed to appear in the court and negotiate with the Yaoundé military court on neutral grounds, but insisted that even if they're coming to court and see that this ruling that was given, slapping them with a life sentence, should be overturned, but that does not mean they will change their stand on their need to have Biafra as Ambazonia as a country, and also the dream to have Ambazonia as a state is still very much alive. So the fact that they're going to court to challenge this does not mean that now they have given up on having their own country. So those are just some of the latest. Let me just read, the latest African states' measures to counter the COVID-19 before I finish. And Algeria, of course, the government has suspended air and sea travel with Europe from March 19th, that is today, and Cameroon, since I think I've read that, and Djibouti said on March it was suspending all international flights. Egypt will suspend all air traffic as its airport from March 19 until March 31st. Prime Minister Mustafa Madboy said, and starting on March 17, Ghana banned entry to anyone who has been to a country with more than 200 coronavirus cases. And Nigeria, government announced it was restricting entry into the country from travelers from China, South Korea, Italy, Iran, Spain, Japan, France, Germany, the US, Norway, the UK, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. And these are the countries that they had already allowed to come to Nigeria. And then all of a sudden they realized, oh my, this coronavirus is really, really serious. And of course, Tunisia, which declared 24 cases of the virus, closed mosques, cafes, and markets, closed its land borders and suspended international flights on March 16th. A lot is happening on this continent, so wherever you are, please keep safe. Let's meet here later at 2 p.m. With another show. But for now, thank you so much for watching. This has been Diaspora Dispatches. I am Miriam Gutum. Good afternoon.
peace must be our goal and our guide. And all that we strive for as a human family, dignity and hope, progress and prosperity, depends on peace. But peace depends on us.